Good afternoon. This is Bonnie Claremont, and I'm going to start by having us introduce ourselves and um, yeah, and I just want to say welcome and thank you so much for joining us. So I'm Bonnie Claremont. I am a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation. I was trying to find myself on the screen. I can't find myself. Um, to see if I'm like but anyway, I am a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation and I reside in St. Paul, Minnesota. I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and we're a national training technical assistance provider. And we work with tribal communities all over the country, all over Indian country, even in urban areas, um, who are addressing issues related to violence against Native women, general crime, and so forth. Um, I have been with the Institute for about 20 years, and prior to that, I worked as an advocate for many years. I'll have Kelly introduce herself and also Heather.
Thanks, Bonnie. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to bring it to you. I'm Kelly Stoner. I work with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and Bonnie and Heather. I think I've worked there for maybe I have been there for 11 years now. Before that, I was a tribal judge, spent about 20 years as a law professor in law schools in Oklahoma and in North Dakota, focusing on issues of violence surrounding Native women and children. And also would just point out TLPI has been a technical assistance provider. You're going to see this slide later on for the tribes that are implementing VAWA 2022. We've been involved since 2013 and we still are today. We're a technical assistance provider still today on that. So welcome. We hope we have a lot of really great, I know we do because Bonnie's doing it, a lot of really great information for you today. And Heather, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. And Bonnie, you look great. You look beautiful. I don't know if you found your camera yet, but you look great. Hi, everyone. My name's Heather Torres. I'm going to be off camera because I have an embarrassing heating pad on my neck and back right now. But I'm going to be helping facilitate our slides and just make sure that everything's running smoothly on our Zoom today. I'm a citizen of San Alfonso Pueblo and a descendant of the Navajo Nation and Mexican peoples. And my role as program director at TLPI, I get to work with these wonderful ladies day to day. I manage our contract work as well as help produce our legally focused and other TTA resources that TLPI puts out. So just humbled to be with you all here again today. And we encourage you to engage. There's going to be chat questions and things. So it's an exciting topic. So thank you all for being here today. Bonnie?
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. I recognize a few names, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but again, welcome. It's good to have you all join us. Next slide. So the title is VAWA 2022, and the subtitle is We Have the Power to Create Change. And I'll talk more about that as we go. So the start of this was back in 2005, where US Congress reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, which for the first time included a tribal title, Title IX, intended to improve safety and justice for Native women and Alaska Native women. And for me, that was just a really exciting time. It's like, finally, we're recognized in terms of the needs that we have in our communities for resources, for us to be able to implement our own, our own traditions, our own justice systems, to start looking at that. It was a good starting place, but still, we had a long ways to go, but at least it was a beginning with the addition of this tribal title. Next slide. And along came VAWA 2022. It was signed into law on March 15th, 2022, and went into effect on October 1st, where tribes could basically begin to implement if they have everything in place, and to begin to do that. It's built on a framework of VAWA 2013 to expand tribal authority to prosecute non-Indians in tribal courts for certain crimes. It changed what, in some cases, who can be charged in tribal court. Kelly, do you want to add anything to this?
Sorry, it takes me, I must be not coordinated this morning, trying to get myself off chat before I talk. No, Bonnie, I think that's great. And I think we're going to get to some real interesting topics here about what can tribes now charge these non-Indians and exactly who they can charge. So I really think that part is very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. So we're basically looking at and celebrating for myself VAWA 2013 and 2022. And I really do call it historic victories. As Obama said in 2013, tribal governments have an inherent right to protect their people, and all women deserve the right to live free from fear. And, you know, when the signing happened, I was at my desk watching it on a live stream, and we had colleagues and friends and relatives there in the room where this was being signed in 2013. And I was bawling, just so elated that this was happening. And a lot of it happened, by creating those allies in Congress, working closely with them. And there was a lot of Native women on the Hill doing that work, particularly from the NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians. But there were, those of us who didn't go to the Hill for these hearings and so forth, but we were in contact with our representatives and our elected officials to support this bill. So it was kind of I don't know, it was a victory across the country. And again, it reminded us that we have the power to create change, to be able to call, and even if nothing else, to leave a message or to talk to, the elected officials, clerks and aides and so forth, so that they just hear this, our voices across the country, calling the representatives and leaving them notes. I'm sure they had a lot of calls like that. So for me, it was just like, if there was anything I could do to be there, I would have, but it was truly a landmark decision to be affirmed, especially by President Obama. Next slide. So the existing jurisdictional framework left victims without adequate protection. There's nothing worse, there's nothing more difficult than to work with someone to be an advocate for a victim who is assaulted by a non-Native perpetrator, and to be able to really not provide a measure of justice that's adequate to the victims that we're working with. It's, they are violated, they're harmed by the crime itself, but yet there's no justice, there's nothing that happens that can be done for the most part, to have that victim, feel some justice about what happened. And I personally believe, and I've said this since I've been doing advocacy work, that it's so difficult to heal without some measure of justice. That healing is difficult when you don't hear the apology, or you don't you see the perpetrator go free and to continue repeating the crimes. It's really brutal, on a lot of victims that we work with. So tribal courts had no criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians in Indian country. And this was mostly from a law that occurred, a Supreme Court decision, Oliphant versus Suquamish in 1978, where U.S. attorneys declined to prosecute many violent crimes that occurred in Indian country. We did a report, and we'll talk more about this report called the Maze of Injustice Report, along with Amnesty International USA, and visited a lot of tribal communities where this was happening, by and large, where it was non-native perpetrators who were sexually assaulting native victims on tribal land, and there was nothing that the tribes could do about it. And it was so frustrating. We heard from the victims themselves, and often, the perpetrators knew full well, I can do this because I can. Your tribe can't touch me. And those were some of the things that were being told to the victims that came forward with their testimonies. Next slide. So empowering tribal nations. VAWA 2013, like I said, affirmed tribal inherent authority to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit domestic violence, dating violence, or violations of qualifying protection orders in Indian country. Further, VAWA 2022 built on this framework and added additional categories of criminal conduct that can be prosecuted against non-Indians in tribal court. Both VAWA 2013 and 2022 are amendments to the Indian Civil Rights Act that can be found at 25 USC 1304. When 2013 happened, it was like I said, it was a huge step forward, but not enough. It covered the, domestic violence, dating violence, and violations of protection orders that happen in Indian country by non-natives, right? Which was, again, it was, affirming our inherent authority. It was affirming that, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough because, the rate of sexual assault against Native women and against Native people, against our children is very high. The data still is pretty much the same. It hasn't changed. Where we see a lot of our Native women, our Native relatives who are being raped by non-Native perpetrators. And that the 2013 still didn't cover that. We still weren't able to hold those offenders accountable who came onto tribal land. So there was still a lot of work to be done. And it's hard, being an advocate in Indian country because you're so busy providing those kind of services, right? And finding resources that victims need, and to work with your local partners, whether it's law enforcement or, the courts, that it's like, who has time to try to work on creating the legislative change that needs to happen to hold offenders accountable, right? And yet we knew, that's what was needed. That kind of change was needed. So a lot of our relatives, as depicted in the picture, went to the Capitol, went to and visit the legislators and met with them and knocked on doors and, asked for their time, even if it's for a few minutes. So with that kind of grassroots advocacy work and momentum, that's how change can happen, is to find the allies and to, create those relationships and really have those voices in Congress. Next slide. So VAWA 2022 was necessary, and why? It quickly became apparent that VAWA 2013 did not go far enough. Tribal courts still had no criminal jurisdiction to protect children who might be abused or victimized alongside their parent, or to prosecute offenders who assaulted tribal law enforcement or other justice officials, And because we know that, law enforcement, they put their lives on the line day to day, right? And they also need protection. They need to be protected from those that may cause them harm. And also, lastly, to provide justice to victims of sexual violence, stalking, or sex trafficking, which we'll talk about in a minute as the new covered crimes under VAWA 2022. And, it's like you all work with these individuals, right? You all work to some extent with children and youth who are abused. Perhaps you know about incidents in your communities where law enforcement are being assaulted, maybe even being killed. And definitely, you work with victims of sexual violence who are perpetrated by non-natives. So again, a huge milestone with VAWA 22. Next slide. So again, data, not a lot has changed over the years. We're still, our native people are still some of the highest, um, population-wise, we're very low in our population, but some of the highest, we experience some of the highest rates of violence like sexual assault, sexual violence, domestic violence, and even just physical violence itself. So more than 4 in 5, I just want to review that top one. More than 4 in 5 American Indian Alaska Native women, which is 84.3%, have experienced partner violence, sexual violence, or stalking in their lifetime. 4 out of 5. Okay. Next slide. So we did some work with Amnesty International, and if you haven't read this report, I strongly encourage you to read it. It's called The Maze of Injustice. We had an opportunity to travel to Oklahoma and also to North Dakota, South Dakota, and also into Alaska, and interviewed a lot of service providers, advocates, law enforcement, first responders, whether that's tribal law enforcement or county sheriffs, um, but mostly a lot of advocates who work on the ground with victims and know day to day the kind of crimes that were occurring in their communities and what was happening to the perpetrators of those crimes. Basically were going unpunished, and knew full well that they weren't going to be punished. And so the data for most of these tribes we visited, it was non-native perpetrators, right? In some communities that may be different. The perpetrators may be tribal members, or still native, but maybe not enrolled in that tribe where the crime occurs. But um, where we visited, it was mostly non-native perpetrators that were committing these crimes. And we were in these communities to look specifically at sexual violence and the rate of sexual violence. So, um, we looked at the DOJ, the Department of Justice statistics, where it said that Native American Alaska Native women are more than 2.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than women in the USA in general, and that 86% of the reported crimes are committed by non-Native men. 86%. And there was a lot of stories there in this report, the Maze of Injustice report, that found that as a result of barriers, including a complex jurisdictional maze and a chronic lack of resources for law enforcement and health services, perpetrators are not being brought to justice. Native American Alaska Native women may never get a police response, may never have access to a sexual assault forensic examination, and may never see their case prosecuted. we heard that time and time again through our, meeting with victims. We had many victims who came forward and provided testimony for this report. And a lot of just horrific stories that came forward from even those, families that lost relatives through violence, through sexual violence and homicide. Um, and it's difficult to hear and to process, knowing that the rate of this violence is so high, and yet the resources were so limited. And as a result of this report and a result of, the legislative changes and the appropriation of more funding out of the Department of Justice in particular, some of that has changed, but they're still under-resourced um, health, departments. There's still a lot of places in Indian country where, it's difficult to get a forensic examination, where victims have to travel in distances where they shouldn't have to travel. Um, so they're still under resourcing, but it's gotten better with the increase in DOJ funding. So I have to say that this report, along with a lot of the grassroots advocacy to create the change that was needed to really push Congress to appropriate and to move these bills along, has created that kind of change. It's just, I can't say enough about, your voices, even as advocates, are so important. I came into this work thinking, as an advocate, I'm just one person, and I'm so busy. I'll let others do it. I'll let others call, or I'll let others go to the Hill, or I'll let someone else provide that testimony. But when it happens, each one, you know, there's a voice there that goes into the legislators' offices. That's one voice. You add, you multiply that on a daily basis, and they can't ignore us. And through that, we were able to succeed. I believe that it took all of us, including those working on the ground. If you have comments, I want to hear, I want to hear what's going on. If, 20, VAWA 2013 has had any positive impact in your communities, what's going on with that in your communities? How has that changed things, if it has? If you're thinking at all about VAWA 22 and maybe working with your elected officials, your tribal laws to get, what's needed in place in order to implement 22, jump in, raise your hand, write something in chat. I really want to hear from you all as well. Next slide. What are your thoughts on this? So far, what the kind of changes that have happened? Any thoughts? What are you thinking as I'm sharing these thoughts with you?
Hey,
Looks
Bonnie.
like Samantha has her hand up.
Hi, Samantha. Oh my
Hey,
God.
I know, long time
Good
no.
to see you.
Good to see you, and thank you for this information. And I've been doing this work for a while, and I'm also a tribal council member here for my tribe at Kauai, and so I attend a lot of the the hearings and the tribal consultations. And don't get me wrong, I'm very appreciative, like you are, for VAWA and the reauthorization. And a lot of people worked really hard to get it where it is, but there's still a huge deficit on the, we don't get justice. And that, I think that component is, and I'm coming from a little tribe here in Southern California where we're PL 282.
Yeah.
The jurisdictional quagmire has still not been worked out. And we're coming from we have a large, almost 20,000 acre reservation. We don't have tribal police. And with VAWA and being able to prosecute like non-Indians, you have to have a lot of things in place because they have the right to due process. And little tribes like us, we're just trying to write grants to get support to get our own law enforcement, or to work collaboratively with like the local sheriff's department. So, while some of these things are on paper and they're, it's great, the reality is justice is still not coming through for a lot of our folks that go missing or are murdered or are assaulted, and yeah. So on one hand, everything you said, Bonnie, just rang true with me. I was here just shaking my head while I was eating my peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So that was it. That's all I wanted to share. I think the good work still continues to get us where we need to be to get justice, because you're so right. You need to be validated, that these things happened. And that's part of our healing journey too. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for that. And I really acknowledge and see you and recognize the good work that you're doing in your community after all these years. Oh my gosh. Samantha's just done some amazing work in her community. It is very small, but regardless of how small, this violence exists everywhere. And it's a little small community. I remember driving up there into almost like a mountainous area and, so isolated and so remote. Um, and you can't help but think, gosh, when the violence happens here, I wonder how victims get help. That was my thought driving up to your community. So, and that's, there's many other communities like yours. So, it's kind of like, how is this going to all play out? How can your community, um, exercise this and, put this into reality for your community, for the victims there, and to hold people accountable in the fullest extent that you can, right? It takes more resources and to provide that kind of measure of justice. It requires a lot of work at the local level, which it's like I'm saying, how do you find time to do that then as an advocate when you're so busy, you know, providing the services and coming to people's aid to be able to like still have time to, you know, to create the kind of change in the allies and the relationships that you need to do. So, boy, I hear you, Samantha. Kudos for being there so long and doing the work that you're doing. Any other comments? Any other questions, feedback? Samantha said, getting old too. And I said, and this is how I feel, and it's the reason why I did advocacy for so long. Victims need, I believe, some measure of justice, and some do want to see their perpetrators prosecuted, right? Whoever they are, non-native or native. That's many victims that I've worked with want that. And this is another way that we can provide that, although it takes so much work to be able to implement these laws. We've always had the right to do so in a traditional way, um, but again, it's a lot of work. But I also just say there's other things that we could do in the meantime to provide victims a measure of justice, right? Maybe we could look at how we could do that in a civil way, how we could still provide that justice because, I worked with a victim and, even for a law enforcement officer to tell a victim, I'm sorry this happened to you, you didn't deserve this, is huge for a victim, so it doesn't, it doesn't really make up for what happened, but that may be the only measure of justice that that victim can get, right? So I just wanted to add that and to keep that in mind as well, that we could work at the local level to help provide some measure of justice, even if perpetrators aren't going to be prosecuted. to the fullest measure that we would like to see them prosecuted. Any additional thoughts before we move on? I welcome your thoughts. What you think about VAWA 22, VAWA 2013 at any time. You could just put it in chat. We have people who are monitoring chat. Okay, next slide. This was a quote that I added. Sharon runs a Native Women's Health Education Resource Center, works with a lot of Native women around health issues. A lot of the people that they work with have been sexually assaulted and may have needs there after an assault happens. She also has a domestic violence shelter there that she operates on the Ihanktawa Reservation in South Dakota. But she said, Maze of Injustice has brought a face to violence and sexual assault in this country that most people have never seen before. The cries from the grassroots women in the country are finally being heard throughout the halls of Congress. Amnesty International and Native women have worked together to bring this issue to the attention of policymakers. It is now time for those policymakers to make changes that will improve the lives of Native women. You know, I had the honor, the privilege, the opportunity to provide testimony to a Senate subcommittee hearing on law enforcement in Indian country. So I had a chance to provide testimony there, and I tell you, I was scared to death. You know, even just writing my testimony, but it's like, you know what you know. Each of you that work with victims in Indian country, you know what you know. You know, people that are receiving the testimony, they have a lot to learn from us. And you know, you can provide that kind of testimony. You can provide that. And, you know, my partner, he just said, just speak from your heart. That's all you have to do. And once you do that, once you connect that, what you know with what you're feeling in your heart, it's like everything then comes easy. And there were many people. They had hearings across the country, even as a result of this report, the Maze of Injustice report. They had several different hearings that they came out into the field to receive testimony. So we had a chance, and others in tribal communities had a chance to provide testimony to the, you know, those subcommittee hearings that they held. And as a result, you know, those are people that work on the ground. There are those where Sharon says the cries from the grassroots women in Indian country. And that's exactly what happened. It was like voices they couldn't ignore, right? So that's what it takes. That's what it takes to create the kind of change that's needed at the congressional level. Next slide. I'm going to have Kelly share some of this with you. VAWA 2013, VAWA 2022, what each reauthorization provided.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. I'll just say also, folks, the journey of this federal statute I think you could get a really good understanding of what the tribes that had implemented 2013, what they were up against, these gaps that Bonnie was referencing. And it's called the 5-year report. I believe 2013 was called Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction. Now we're at STCJ. So those terms have changed. But if you will Google, I don't know if we have it in our resources here, that 5-year report, you're going to see all kinds of stories from the first tribes and what they were up against, these huge gaps, which really, I think, went far in moving Congress forward towards VAWA 2022. And as Bonnie was saying earlier, Oliphant is the problem here. Before Oliphant, tribes had this inherent sovereign power to exercise criminal jurisdiction over anyone who committed crimes in their Indian country. They were like a sovereign nation. And then after Oliphant, the Supreme Court says, not so fast, tribes. You don't have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit crimes in your Indian country. I really didn't think in my lifetime that I would see that overruled, but I do think it's been partially overruled now by this federal statute, both 2013 and 2022. So wanted to get everybody kind of grounded in that. The problem is still there. Oliphant still applies to those tribes that cannot implement, for whatever reason, resources, infrastructure, just don't want to. They don't want to have to follow all the rules that this federal statute requires them to follow. Those tribes still must deal with Oliphant on a daily basis. So let's take a look at this slide. And what this slide is doing is telling you, sort of wanting you to see how far we have all come since 2013. And again, I never thought I would see anything like 2013. Then we move on to 2022. It's even more expansive. Congress is saying, we restricted you, but now we're loosening some of those restrictions here. So let's take a look at 2013 first, and we see only 3 crimes. I think it's safe to say that Congress was a little nervous about this, about loosening this restriction, this criminal authority tribes would have over these non-Indians committing crimes. So perhaps they thought it would be good to start slow. Let's only put 3 crimes in here. There's lots of testimony, as Bonnie was pointing out, the Maze of Injustice report, lots of information coming to Congress about domestic violence statistics in Indian country, dating violence, and violations of a protection order, quite frankly. So we get those first 3 crimes coming out. Now, I think this has kind of come to light after I finish this slide. We get those coming to light, but in 2013, we also see Congress saying, we better give the definitions to the tribes. We will tell the tribes what these elements of these crimes are here. And so that's what we got. We also were given in this 2013 federal statute, I won't say the word given, we were told that in order to qualify to exercise this criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians for these 3 crimes there, the crime had to occur in the tribe's Indian country. Well, that makes sense. The victim must be an Indian. Okay. And the defendant had to have these sufficient ties to the community. Speaking as a former tribal prosecutor, this made this tough. I believe those sufficient ties, and I'm going off my memory here, but so it might not be exactly right, but it was something like the defendant had to live or work in Indian country or be married to a tribal member, but the tribal member didn't have to reside in Indian country, or the defendant could be married to an Indian who's not a tribal member, but then they had to live in Indian country, the spouse. So you see that I'm like, oh my gosh, we've got all these elements we have to prove according to tribal law, and then I have to layer all of these things on there. In addition, it required the tribes to provide certain due process protections for these non-Indian defendants. There's a whole list of them. They're not all captured here on the slide, but you can find those in the Indian Civil Rights Act, because the statute actually modified the Indian Civil Rights Act. And I want to say that's 25 USC 1304, but Heather, I know you're out there, and if that's wrong, you can put that in the chat. It might be 1302. Okay, so now let's move forward here just to contrast for you VAWA 2022. So we're chugging along. 2013, there are only 5 tribes that were pilot tribes, and they had to had their codes approved by the Department of Justice. They were really under the microscope with their tribal laws and this due process requirement. Okay, so then we get that 5-year report coming out, and you know what? There's no habeas petitions by these non-Indians, and that's a legal maneuver where they will eventually want to go into federal court and ask the federal court to stop the tribe. Either the tribe doesn't have jurisdiction or there was something incorrect going on, and they want the feds to step in. Well, we didn't have any of those, not that were completed. We had a couple of filed, but nobody followed up on them, so they went away. So VAWA 2013, whatever Congress was afraid that was going to happen, it did not materialize. Fast forward to 2022. So what we get now that I find so exciting is, well, there's 6 more crimes. First of all, we go over to 2013. We still have those 3. And we have these new ones that you see bulleted here. We have child violence, because in that 5-year report, you're going to see prosecutors, you're going to see advocates saying there are children involved. Children are getting hurt. We can't prosecute the non-Indian who's hurting the children. Then we see sexual violence, which is broad enough under this federal, I'll get to that in a minute, the federal terms, to include stranger sexual assault. Okay, so that's super important. We have stalking, we have sex trafficking, we have assaults of tribal justice personnel, because that was complained about in the 5-year report. And we have obstruction of justice, which is a huge criminal statute, the way it's written in VAWA 2022. And amazingly, we didn't get, except for sex trafficking, we did not get Congress giving the tribes definitions. They may give the tribes some jurisdictional hooks that they have to plead and prove, but tribes use their own laws. The tribe determines which one of their criminal statutes will fall into each one of these baskets here: child violence, sexual violence, domestic violence. In other words, tribes get to define what domestic violence is and what a domestic violence crime looks like. That's amazing. In all cases except sex trafficking, Congress says, look to tribal law. Look to tribal law. So that was a big asset here. Also, some things remain the same as 2013. The crime still has to occur in Indian country. The victim has to still be an Indian, except if we're talking about assaults of tribal justice personnel or obstruction of justice, under the federal law, that is a non-Indian perpetrator doesn't matter if it's an Indian victim or non-Indian victim, tribe can still go forward and prosecute it. And that is a great improvement. Let's see, the defendant's ties to the community, which personally, as a former prosecutor, I felt like, oh, can you make the burden any heavier? It's gone. It's been totally removed. And over here at domestic violence and dating violence of 2013, it had this term that says violence committed is an act of violence committed. Now that may sound okay, but as a prosecutor, I'm wondering, what is violence committed? What is that? And so we had memos on it. We had some U.S. attorneys come talk to us about it, the tribes that wanted to implement. It was problematic because let me give you an example. If you're a perpetrator in a domestic violence situation and you throw a knife towards the victim, it doesn't hit them. Is that an act of violence? Questionable. We just didn't know the answer to that. So that term, act of violence, is gone. It's totally gone. So if a tribe says a domestic violence crime can include emotional abuse, can include all other things that you can think of that may not be physical violence, tribes can do that now under VAWA 2022. Oh, I wanted to also say the only due process change from 2013, those stayed the same, was the requirement now that the non-Indian defendants must be provided notice of their right to seek that habeas corpus in federal court. It must be given to them in writing. Okay, so if you have questions, you can ask. I know that was fast. It's a lot, but it's very exciting. And Bonnie, I'll turn it back over to you.
I just have one question, Kelly.
Okay.
Does that include the public 280 reses too?
Great question. PL 280 did not strip tribes really of anything. They still have all of their powers in place. Now we do have Oliphant, right? The Supreme Court can put some restrictions on tribes' authority to exercise their sovereignty. But yes, in short, PL 280 tribes can absolutely, if they can meet the requirements of VAWA 2022, if they have the infrastructure, if they even want to implement plan to implement and seek grant funding for that, yes, you have that criminal authority. Okay, Bonnie?
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. That was very good. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to unmute or just put it in your chat. You know, my wish for doing this is really to encourage just plain old everyday grassroots community people, advocates, to really understand how important your voice is in creating this change. These changes came about because of that kind of impetus, right? People that were just tired of hearing these crimes committed over and over again and not being able to hold people accountable, hold offenders accountable. And, you know, just those voices, just to be able to say those things to someone really does mean a lot. It really does. Next slide. So these are the covered crimes that, so it's the 2013 ones that were already in place, the domestic violence, dating violence, protection order violations. And the new covered crimes are, again, sexual violence, stalking, sex trafficking, child violence, obstruction of justice, and assaults against justice personnel. And you'll hear them referred to as covered crimes. I just can't even tell you how much this means, you know, especially, you know, the sexual violence is, you know, is huge for me, for that law to have been adopted. And it's just remarkable. I can't even tell you, working as a rape crisis advocate for the number of years that I did, and comparing the number of victims you work with to the number of victims that actually have their cases prosecuted is just the differences. There's, you know, I could probably count on one hand in a year's time, if that, of cases of prosecutions that I would actually advocate for. So again, you know, I think it's just it's such a huge milestone. Next slide.
Bonnie, there is a question in chat. Do you want me to read it for you?
Please, I don't.
Okay. So this is from Joanne Kuehler. Hi, thank you for your summarization. Bonnie, I have a quick question. To be considered an Indian victim, is tribal membership a requirement? I know sometimes there are barriers for some Native folks to get membership.
I'm not sure. I think they have to have some to qualify for enrollment. Kelly, can you answer that? I'm not even sure about.
I'm gonna tell you, oh, sorry, I'll turn my camera on. Gonna tell you we don't have, well, we have an easy answer if they're tribal members, right? If they're not tribal members, that becomes murkier. It depends on if does the tribal code say who's Indian, who's not Indian? Do they recognize them as Indian? Do they have some degree of Indian blood? Are they participating in tribal community events? So that could be a situation there. I can tell you as a prosecutor, I also had occasion to prosecute a tribal member who had unenrolled themselves so that they could commit a crime and thought they had beat the system there. And that did not go well for them because we, laid the foundation for the Indian status. Were they receiving IHS? Were they, lots of different pieces came in there, and the tribal judge held that they were a Native person for jurisdictional purposes. So that is a great question. We could talk all day about that, go through endless hypotheticals, and the answer could be different depending on your tribal code. And remember, if a non-Indian well, this would be the victim though. They wouldn't be seeking habeas, but I could see the non-Indian wanting a dismissal on all but those two covered crimes where it doesn't matter the race of the victim. I could see a defendant seeking habeas because the Indian victim requirement had not been established. And we would have to think that hopefully the tribal code would give that federal judge some guidance. If not, we have to go into whatever circuit we're in that we think that federal court is in, and we're going to have to look at that federal case law on it. Because believe it or not, all across the United States, the federal courts cannot agree on how to demonstrate whether someone who's not enrolled is indeed an Indian. There are different tests in different parts of the United States. So very complicated question there, but great question. Thank you.
There's another one from Samantha Thornsberry. Are there minimum and maximum punishments outlawed in VAWA for these crimes that are prosecuted through tribal court?
Well, you want me to take this one, Bonnie? Okay, there are no minimum maximum in VAWA 2022, but what you have to look at is whether the tribe has enacted TLOA or enhanced sentencing provisions. You'll find the parameters of what a tribe that hasn't met the requirements in the Indian Civil Rights Act for this enhanced sentencing. You can find those parameters, and Heather T probably remembers them right off the top of her head, but I'm afraid to even say unless I look it up. Every tribe can still utilize those sentences. If the tribe meets the requirement and has enacted TLOA or the enhanced sentencing, they can go ahead and put them in for much longer and much higher fines. So I hope that helps. But really what we're going to look at, like Congress wants us to, we are going to look to tribal law because each tribe will have certain sentences within those parameters of ICRA for each of their crimes, and it may vary.
Thanks, Kelly. And I just asked Abby, who joined us as well. Thanks, Abby, for joining us. She's going to add some links to some recent TLPI resources that have just come out, both on VAWA 2022, which I believe is linked already in the presentation, but we also did a separate publication on TLOA, Tribal Law and Order Act Enhanced Sentencing Authority, which Kelly just briefly outlined. So there's two new resources that are available and up on our website if folks are interested in learning more.
Free for download. Just know that the TLPI publications, and I believe Heather or Abby, correct me if I'm wrong, those sentencing parameters are set out in 25 USC, I want to say 1302 or 1303, the Indian Civil Rights Act. somebody wants to double check me on that, maybe we could put that in the chat too, if you actually want to read the federal statute.
Thank you very much for taking that question, Kelly, and thank you for the question as well, Samantha. I love it. So I'm just wanting to hear from you all that are that have joined us about as you look at the covered crimes. Next slide, sorry. As you look at the covered crimes that we've discussed, which of these do you spend more time on in your work?
I had to take over hosting duties today, so folks can use the chat for this one. That'd be great. Or you can raise your hand.
DV, Samantha said. Okay. Sexual assault.
Yeah, SA,
Okay.
sexual assault.
Sexual assault. Wow. Domestic violence. DV, NSA. Okay.
Can I say just a word, Bonnie, while folks are still putting some text in there? I don't want folks to, because we don't have enough time during this presentation to kind of go down in the weeds about what might be included in these covered crimes. But I want you to remember, those of you working in DV and SA, in cases where there are children involved, it is not, it would not be risky, in my opinion, my legal opinion, to think that child abuse would fit under this child violence, possible child endangerment. Some tribes are even capturing some child neglect in there, child in need of supervision. All of those pieces where you're having emotional abuse, those kinds of things against children, those kinds of cases now can be prosecuted if you have a non-Indian perpetrator and the victim, it would be a child, is Native.
I
So
was just thinking too of strangulation, right? That could be a federal offense and they would look at more time if that was part of the incident. Am I correct, Kelly?
Strangulation is not a covered crime, but thinking like a prosecutor, I would say, could we fit that in under domestic violence? Is that a domestic assault? How old was the victim? The victim would have to be Native. Could I, if the victim is under the age of 18, can I fit that under child violence? So yes, there are ways to get at that. And possibly we can get at it even using the tribal strangulation statute, but the prosecutor will have to plead and prove the pieces that are required by VAWA 2022. It gets confusing. I don't want to talk about different kinds of facts that a prosecutor can plead and prove, but they have the ability to do that unless the tribal code prohibits it. So I think you could get at it.
and I'm sure there's, you know, a lot of strangulations that happen within the context of domestic violence, without a doubt.
And I was thinking of sexual assault too, Bonnie, and
Yeah.
I did hear in one presentation that the maximum for an you know, somebody being charged with that can be higher than a normal DV or sexual assault. That's kind of why I brought it up, because they could get a harsher penalty.
Yes.
Well, you could, I mean, there's nothing to stop the tribe from prosecuting it as well. The tribe can do it even if the feds are doing it. Typically, I mean, there's something, I think it's called the Pettit Doctrine or something. I don't want to bore everybody with legal maneuvers here, but there's sort of a policy in place where the U.S. attorneys will not prosecute if the tribe is prosecuting already. So you would want to be sure prosecutors working with that federal prosecutor to work out those kinks. If the tribe feels like, according to tribal law, they cannot get the sentence that they really feel like is necessary.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, for, I mean, all intents and purposes, strangulation is like attempted manslaughter or something, so you would think there would be some provision and some room for us to be able to prosecute accordingly. So I just in looking at the responses to what kind of crimes you all are working on, it's like pretty evenly split between DV and SA. So that's great. I'm glad that you're seeing both, for those of you that are seeing sexual assault as well. Which makes it even more important that, you know, tribes exercise this, you know, criminal jurisdiction over sexual assault. It's just, it's time. It's past time. Just feel some urgency about it. Next slide. So exercising STCG, I'll get it right yet. STCJ, which is Special Tribal Criminal Jurisdiction. And I finally got used to the other acronym. Now I have to switch it up real quick. So I want to just be able to look at what can we do to help you all. And I've been on this kind of a tangent for ever since this all came to pass, where this was passed by Congress, you know, VAWA 22, is how can we help tribes just get excited about this and want to exercise, you know, criminal jurisdiction. What is it? What do you need, right? And I see advocates as being in a good place because you're there, you know the needs, you know the importance of holding offenders accountable, even though in terms of your direct services, that's kind of not your area, but it's really connected. It really is. When we talk about justice for victims, you know, there's so many that are just crying out for that. And anytime they make a police report, it's really them saying, I really do want some justice. I want someone to hold this person accountable, if for no other reason than, you know, to maybe be contacted and say, you know, you're being named in this crime, and we need to, you know, ask you some questions. Even that is putting someone on notice, right? But to be able to go beyond that and to hold that person fully accountable for the choice they made to commit the crime, I think that is it's so important, so important. So next slide.
Can I tag on to your comment, Bonnie?
Absolutely.
So Bonnie, I don't even know if you're aware of this, but you know, there's been some of us at TLPI, we've been working with it's called the Intertribal Working Group. We're going to have, or the ITWIG, we're going to have a slide on that in a few minutes. But when we first started doing this work, Bonnie, back in 2013, 2014, when the tribes were trying to be pilot tribes and get all their codes approved and by the Department of Justice. Did you know that advocates were not invited to the ITWIG meetings? There was some sort of philosophy that if you added advocates to the mix of the lawyers and the judges, that would mix everybody up and it would slow down the progress. And I don't, you know, Indian Country is a small place, but I will tell you, Carmen O'Leary, everybody should give Carmen O'Leary a shout out because she is the unsung hero. She and I had a conversation and I said, Carmen, push it. Talk to the U.S. Attorney, talk to the Office on Violence Against Women, push it. We need advocates there. How are we ever going to get codes that are trauma-informed and victim-centered without the voice of the advocates? And she did it. And she was told no in a very unceremoniously type fashion, but she did not give up. And it wasn't a year later now. Advocates are there. We have advocates on the TA staff now. Advocates usually do at least one presentation at the ITWIG. So Bonnie is exactly right. You have a voice. Keep using it. Keep using it. It makes everything better for victims to have you at the table.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you very much for that. So I'm going to ask Kelly to take the next couple slides. Well, for this next one for sure.
Yeah, happy to do it. So what do you need to do? This information is really for those tribes, smaller tribes perhaps, that Samantha, maybe you're not quite ready. You have other things that are really on that front burner that you need to address before you can think about these things. You're gathering information. You're just wondering, how would we even go about this? And so here are the first steps that we think. These are just good questions to ask yourself. Go take a look at your tribal code and see if there's anything in that code that would have to be amended. Probably so. For instance, some tribal constitutions say that the tribe would have criminal jurisdiction over Indians. The old way, you know, the way that it was after Oliphant. But now they would have to go back and amend their constitution. Some had to amend their codes. And just FYI, just a little interesting fact. There have also been tribes that are members of the ITWIG. It's free. If you're interested in this at all, even if you're not ready to implement, you should think about it. We have 2 meetings a year in person. You will get lots of emails from Chia at TLPI, keeping you updated on all things ITWIG. But there was some pushback on the term special, because some of the tribal judges especially didn't think this was, why is this special? Tribes have always had it. It should just be tribal criminal jurisdiction. So just in case you show up there and people are irritated at that word special, and then, well, Bonnie, we don't need to worry about it because they'll probably change it in a little bit anyway, and we have to learn a whole new set of words. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out. What changes are needed to your criminal code? How are you defining your crimes, due process? Are you giving notice in writing of that non-Indian's right to habeas corpus review? What training will your law enforcement need, your judges, your court staff, your advocates? What kind of trainings are you looking at? And then you will also be needing a public defender. Tribes are doing that in a variety of different ways. Some use law schools, some just contract with different lawyers in the area. Do your existing judges, do they have to be sufficiently trained, the statute says? Do they have the training they need? What kinds of facilities? If you think you're going to incarcerate somebody, do you have a jail? If you don't, tribes are also contracting with counties, cities to use their facilities. Let's see, what kinds of changes are necessary to your jury system? There was a lot of pushback in 2013 because one of the requirements of the jury system here is that no group can be kept off the jury, including non-Indians. So that immediately meant tribes that had criminal juries for their Indians. For the non-Indians, they had to at least have a jury pool that was pulling in some non-Indians, and there's a whole formula that goes with that. Some tribes didn't want to do it. Some tribes said, okay, we will do it, but we will have special juries that we will call on when we have a non-Indian defendant. The rest of the Indian defendants will only have Indian juries. So we have it across the board, different approaches tribes are taking to all of these questions. And then how will you fund necessary changes? Usually at the ITWIG, we will talk about funding to give you the resources for federal grants and any other kinds of funding that might cover these kinds of costs, because it will cost. Okay, next slide, Bonnie, I think it's yours. Or maybe it's mine, Bonnie. Sorry. This
It's-
is, this is the Edwig group, everybody, that we keep talking about at our very first meeting in August 2013. And if you could make that any bigger, I know I'm in there somewhere and Jerry Gardner's in there somewhere. So this is at the National Advocacy Center in Columbia, South Carolina. Our good friend Leslie Hagan, who, well, to me, she's the boss here of the NAC. I don't know if that's her official title, but she invites us there once a year and we all meet there. And oh my goodness, they have a free lunchroom and breakfast. It is just delicious if you're interested in that sort of thing. So please do consider joining the ITWIG, and you can join by simply sending an email to chia, CHIA, at tlpi.org. And if you have grant funding to attend, this next meeting will be, somebody will probably have the date like Abby. It's the end of June at Tulalip, beautiful Tulalip Reservation. Then we'll have another later in the year at the NAC again. Yes, and you do not have to have implemented to join the ITWIG. You just need to be interested in getting more information. So I'll turn it over to you again, Bonnie.
Thank you so much. You know, I always just am amazed at the work that we do at TLPI. This is huge. For me, this is huge. You know, being able to work with tribes to get them to exercise STCJ is, I think, is just huge. And we've waited as advocates, we've waited so long for this to happen. And we have people who have so much knowledge about the laws and as well as the needs. People like Chia, you know, who really get it as far as the needs of victims and how this is so important. Creating this measure of justice in our communities is just is important. And this is an amazing group of people that are sharing that kind of knowledge and wisdom with one another in order to implement these laws. So it excites me, and I'm so proud of TLPI for being a huge part of it, as well as my colleague Heather Torres, who's on this webinar. So I have to say, I don't think I say it enough. So if you have a chance, if you have people who you think should be participating in ITWIG, call Chia, contact Chia. She'll get you hooked up. Next slide.
And I see, Bonnie, I see Abby's put the meetings in there, the meeting dates, and Chia's email in there. And if I could just say one more word before we move on, Bonnie, about the ITWIG group. I have never been involved with a group that is so full of grace, so willing to share and support one another. The tribes that have implemented in 2013 and moved on, they share everything with the tribes that are thinking about it. They will share their forms. They will assist them in any way they can. And we also have Alaska tribes coming in now, and this group also shares with Alaska, helps them brainstorm around certain things and tries to help them find ways to hold these non-Indians accountable.
Thank you for that. I've sat in on workshops that have been done by tribes that are implementing exercise this criminal jurisdiction of 2013. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I wanted to like jump up and clap and run up and hug them because they were speaking the language that I've been wanting to hear of holding offenders accountable and how much work that entails, but they're doing the work. And having them have that experience and their willingness to share that is just, it's amazing. For me, it's just amazing. So, and this is the whole purpose for this webinar, that I firmly believe with all that I am and all that I've done is creating legislative change is advocacy. that, you know, we're more about, we're not just about helping victims who have experienced these crimes firsthand and everything that goes along with it, all of the struggles to heal and to regain some sense of balance and normalcy in their lives. But we also have, you know, that knowledge that we can apply to create the kind of changes that are needed to see that kind of justice that victims need, right? Victims and their families. So that's an arm of advocacy that I think we need to exercise and to learn more about. So supporting your tribe to create or change existing tribal laws in order to exercise STCJ is advocacy, very, very much so at its root, is about change, systems change, social change, and creating a system that's going to be responsive, which is within our tribal laws, which is within our power to do that. Okay, next slide. I threw this slide in here because I created this way, way back, I don't know, I think in the 90s, to look at the differences in what we do as advocates versus what others do in maybe in the medical or social services field, that there's some distinct differences back. And some of these, there's a little overlap, right? But, you know, I cut my teeth on the grassroots advocacy model and how important it is that we also look at how can we continue to create the kind of changes that are needed at different levels, and especially at the legislative level, which can be PL 280, could be federal, but it also can be within our own tribal laws, right? That we have that because we're citizens of our nations. So we get to do that. We get to talk to our legislators and say, this law, you know, this needs to be enacted, you know, because this is how it's going to impact the people that I work with every day on the ground. And they're wanting this, they're needing this change, they're needing this justice, right? So I added the slide just to show the unique differences, that we're more than doing case planning. We're more than meeting people at the hospital, that there's an arm of what we do that can create the kind of changes that are needed. So I'm not going to go into detail with this, but I wanted to share it with you, just so that you know that we have the power to create change. Next slide. So what can you do to encourage your tribe to implement STCJ? Are there any things that you can do that come to mind that are doable at this point? Or maybe you've already started, maybe you've already looked into what is needed at, you know, within my tribe to be able to implement these laws. And put it in your chat. Anything that comes to mind. What can you do? You have your elected officials. Any thoughts? Two. Share educational resources. Thank you. Absolutely. Any of these things that we've shared, I welcome you, invite you, encourage you to share these resources that we've shared in chat with your elected officials. I even suggest looking at your own tribal laws and see what kind of changes need to be made there. If you need any help, you know, understanding what those laws contain and what are the gaps, what are the things that need to be changed in order to be able to exercise, there's a lot of resources that are available to help you with that. So I wanted just to get you thinking about your role as advocates, your role as service providers, whatever you do in your community, you have a say. And you have the ability to create the kind of change that's needed in order to further hold people accountable that come onto your tribal lands that are committing these crimes. They're making choices to commit the crimes. And because they make those choices, they need to be held accountable for those choices, right? So that's really my message. Kathleen said, I have a small tribe, but just show my tribe statistics in our community. Absolutely. Absolutely. Showing, educating your community about these problems that are happening that, on a day-to-day basis is so important. Okay, next slide. And I say legislative change, which is what we've been talking about. And I just, from a personal point of view, I started this work as an advocate way back in the 70s and early 80s as an advocate at a local shelter, domestic violence shelter. And I was there as a volunteer and then also relief staff. And I helped start the shelter where I was volunteering. And, that gave me a lot of satisfaction to helping women and just being there to sit with women, do the overnight shifts. And never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I could be a part of legislative change, right? That was like pie in the sky. So I just want to read Bernie. She said, Bernie's comment, lack of funding is always an issue. Lack of qualified professionals who are willing to go to reservations and work with tribes. That was Bernie's comment about what she could do, maybe what you need in order to exercise some of this. Absolutely. But that was in my wildest dreams that I could provide any kind of input into creating legislative change. And it was out of curiosity because some of my colleagues who I adored and I looked up to were doing just that. So I went to a meeting where I learned how how you get a bill together, right? You find a sponsor for the bill. You provide testimony. You can even help one another write the testimony, to draft your testimony, how to present it. So there's like steps to it too, but it all starts with having some correspondence and communication and relationship with your elected officials, right? That's where it starts. And also, training is available. And I just say participation. You look at how can we, there's nothing better, let me tell you, there's nothing better than to, see someone in court that's committed a crime against this person that you're working with, and to see them, held accountable in your own court, in your own tribal court. There's nothing better. I guarantee you that is such a good feeling to know that they have to answer to someone for a crime that they committed. So think about that. This picture is of a woman. She's a Lakota woman who provided testimony where 2013 was enacted and signed into law by President Obama. Her name is Lisa Ayat from the Lakota tribe. And she's wearing a dress that was worn and made by Tilly Black Bear. And Tilly was an advocate. She was one of the founding mothers of our work within domestic violence in Indian country way back. She was the head of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence for a number of years and just did a lot of work. And she is, you don't get any more grassroots than what Tilly was back then. She worked with her local tribal leaders formed a lot of alliances with her tribal leaders, you know, got them to appropriate resources for her shelter. She started the White Buffalo Calf Women's Shelter in Rosebud, South Dakota. She passed a few years back, but did a tremendous amount of work, went to the Hill, went to, you know, the Capitol, met with presidents, met with her elected officials, just as a plain old everyday advocate, grassroots advocate, and said, this is what my community needs, and I'm depending on you to provide what we need. So that's Tilly, and this is the dress that she wore, that Lisa wore when she provided her testimony at this time. So I wanted to share that our voices are so important. Next slide. And this is again about the report with the link to where to access the report. Here's some of our resources. This is an updated report that was put out by Amnesty. Changes that have been made, some of the progress as a result of the report. This was developed, I think, published in 2022. Still identifying a lot of the problems that exist. Okay. Here's our contact information. And please, if there's anything that we could do to help you, any questions that you have, email is the best way to reach me, or either one of us, actually. Any questions? I see we're out of time. And I have to say parting words, you know, when you look at your tribal laws, it isn't always just lawyers who can change tribal laws. You have a voice as advocates to be able to say, this is what we need in this law, even as far as incorporating some of your own traditional language and the importance of, you know, keeping your tribal traditions as part of your laws is so important. And you have that kind of knowledge. And if you don't, you can also, you know, have your elders come forward and be able to provide that kind of wisdom and knowledge that can be written into your tribal codes and your laws. So I encourage that as well. So I came into the Tribal Law and Policy Institute thinking it was up to the lawyers to write tribal laws. And boy, I learned very quickly that no, you know, I have a voice and we can work together with lawyers and others in the community to enact tribal laws. So you can take your laws and look at how can you make them appropriate to be able to exercise criminal jurisdiction over these covered crimes. All right, that's it for today. Thank you again for joining us. This is MUSAC's contact information, link to their website, filled with a lot of good resources there as well.
I just wanted to thank TLPI and Bonnie and Kelly and everybody that shared. And I just want to say thank you for attending today. We know your time is valuable, and we just want to bring resources that you'll be able to bring back to your community. Yawangowa.